Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Scott Samuelson, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Kirkwood Community College on the Iowa City campus. Almost exactly 50 years ago, on January 31st, 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong began the Tet Offensive, one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War. Though our government's official line was that American victory was just around the corner, support for the war among the populace was fast eroding. By the end of 1968, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, two major critics of the Vietnam War, had been assassinated, and the Democratic Party was torn apart at its convention in August when anti-war protesters were attacked by the Chicago police. William Faulkner once famously said, "The past isn't dead, it's not even past." This seems particularly true of the Vietnam War, which many of us just revisited in the popular new documentary by Ken Burns, or watched the unraveling of through the release of the Pentagon Papers and Steven Spielberg's new movie, The Post. What is the legacy of Vietnam? How has this great American defeat shaped how we think about the military, politics, war, and foreign policy? We have a great panel on today to discuss the Vietnam War and its aftermath. To my left is Al Fisher, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Coe College. Thanks for being on, Al.
Thank you.
Donald Tyne, the Director of Veterans Affairs of Lynn County. Thank you for being on, Don.
You bet.
And at the end, Derek Buckaloo, a Professor of History at Coe College. Thanks for being on, Derek.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Well, Derek, maybe we can start down with you. Ken Burns and Lynn Novick state at the beginning of their documentary that the American war in Vietnam was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, American overconfidence, and Cold War miscalculations. Does that seem right? What was behind Vietnam?
Well, that's a lot of description in that piece. And of course, you run some risk if you counter it by suggesting that these were dishonorable men, and that might be going too far. But I think what I would usually say is that these were American men at a certain time with certain identities that had them look upon the rest of the world in certain ways. And they certainly believed in what they were doing, that the higher good here was, as they would have seen it, containing communism. And certainly without the Cold War, it's hard to fathom how the United States ever would have gotten involved in Vietnam. In fact, when Ho Chi Minh was writing to Harry Truman in the wake of his Declaration of Independence of Vietnam in 1945, he was hoping to get American attention because his concern was actually that it wouldn't get on the Americans' radar given everything that they had to worry about in the wake of World War II. Little did he know that it would get on the Americans' radar, but the Americans would go the other way, side with the French, and then ultimately, of course, move in and fight the American war in Vietnam beginning in 1965, if we date it from there. But I think it can be misleading to frame it in those words because what you miss is the ideology of American policymakers, which structured the way they thought about the world and justified the choices. They knew that this meant killing lots of people. They knew that this ultimately might mean committing Americans to fight on the other side of the globe, and they were certainly willing to do that at the time. So I think there are a lot of issues with that phrasing.
Sure. I just got to ask you, you're a historian of the Vietnam War, and a question that I've had my whole life in some sense is, could we have avoided it? I mean, or was the ideology just so strong in the air that it was inevitable that at some level we were going to get enmeshed in this war? Or could we have gone a different road and said, no, you know what, yeah, we did it, but it was a mistake, and we could have done something else. It was conceivable that we would have gone down a different road.
Well, there are a lot of books that have been written on this kind of argument, whether structurally the Cold War was so terrifying and American anti-communist ideology was so great and American power was so great that it was close to inevitable. Historians, of course, don't like to deal in inevitabilities because then there's nothing to explain. But others have argued, and while I lean to it would have been pretty hard not to do it.
Right.
There are other historians that would accentuate the choices that were available. And to give you one example, Frederick Logevall in his book Choosing War, which is about the crucial decisions that the Johnson administration makes in 1965, argues that actually, while if you looked at public opinion polls, it looked like Americans wanted to be tough on communists, it was relatively shallow opinion. And there were opinion leaders and editorialists who were counseling against doing it. The major European allies were all opposed to this and didn't think it was the right thing to do, and often had bright ideas about how this should be avoided. And even members of the Lyndon Johnson administration, including Hubert Humphrey, when he ends up as the vice president to Johnson in early 1965, makes a compelling argument for avoiding all of this. Johnson proceeded to shut him out of the meetings on Vietnam for the next year. So he wasn't interested in that argument. And of course, the brain trust around him, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, believed wholeheartedly that this was the right thing to do. And ultimately, that's who was helping him make those decisions. But even, final thing I want to note, even Johnson, we know much more about this now, had a lot of mixed feelings about this and was very concerned about this. We now have telephone transcripts of his conversations with Senator Richard Russell from Georgia, a mentor, important mentor of his, and they get on the phone and they're actually quite clear that this is a mess and they shouldn't go anywhere near it. Yet Johnson concludes that if he doesn't do what he sees as the manly or the necessary thing to do, that he might even, he at least plays with the idea that he might be impeached. I think that was him trying to rationalize it. But in certain ways, this came to Johnson in 1965 and he had to make the decision. In no way would I argue that we should let Kennedy or Eisenhower or Truman off the hook. Particularly the Eisenhower administration could have made some different choices, but they were firm, true believers in the Cold War in the 50s.
Well, I want to get Don in on this real quick first, though. I mean, I'm kind of curious. You deal with all sorts of Vietnam vets. You yourself were drafted at the very end of the war. I mean, just generally speaking, what do you see as the legacy of the Vietnam War and how we've come to look back on it and think about it?
Well, one of the things a lot of Vietnam veterans will tell you is we've taught the nation how not to treat veterans. And a lot of them World War II or Korean War veterans who are trying to get Vietnam veterans to join the American Legion and posts like that, Vietnam veterans will say, why should I join? Because when I was 19 and I went to your post, you guys were calling us baby killers. And the feeling I also get is a lot of resentment. The ground troops actually believed that if the politicians would have stayed out of the war, it could have been a winnable war. And many of them will tell me that the Tet Offensive, we had them on the run, and we could have pushed it. But that's the ground troops that are talking to me. Also, they are probably the leaders, though, are reaching out to our younger veterans and making them feel welcome. They're the ones that are in these parades when they bring the KIAs back, and they're the ones that are there to try to help the spouses when the young family soldiers gone to Iraq or Afghanistan. So those are kind of the things that I hear and see. The other tragedy is a misunderstanding of why are they still struggling with PTSD? And what I believe is many of them got home. Some of them did turn to drugs and alcohol, but most of them were successful, and that's a stereotype that a Vietnam veteran carries that he resents. Most Vietnam veterans were very successful, and a lot of them are coming to me now in retirement and having flashbacks of Vietnam. They use work as an escape mechanism to avoid those memories and a career and things like that. So that's I guess the snapshot of what I experienced.
Yeah, and I want to come back to some of those, but let's get Al in on this too. I mean, so here we get involved in this thing that seems almost inevitable. We have troops trying to struggle with the idea of, is politics the problem or is something else the problem? At some point, it seems that we get enmeshed in a war that is unwinnable. And yet we continue on with it. What does that do to people? What does that do to the American consciousness?
I think when you consider the gap between the private doubts that many officials had and their public optimism, one of the ways of perhaps explaining that, they're persevering even in what from the very beginning to many policymakers seemed to be an uphill fight. You need to look at domestic political considerations. I mean, if you look at the Johnson transcripts that Derek mentioned earlier, Johnson seems almost obsessed with not having another who lost China debate that followed the takeover of China by Mao Zedong and the communists in 1949. And he at some point says they'd impeach somebody who'd allow that, right? So, but I think the legacy that created of policymakers doing things that they felt increasingly uneasy about was the very severe erosion of trust in government that began. An off-cited poll survey item that was administered over a period of about a decade and a half was a declarative statement, asking respondents to respond to a declarative statement. The federal government can be relied upon to do the right thing most of the time. In 1964, about 75% of Americans said yes to that item. 10 years later, in 1974, 25% said yes.
Precipitous drop.
And I've been surprised when I looked at that, at more granular data on that issue recently, that yes, Vietnam was responsible. Vietnam under Johnson was responsible for a good deal of that, but Watergate was responsible much more. And of course, Watergate was in good part a result of Vietnam, as the film Post shows so effectively.
Those twinned pieces are key to understanding the caving in of that.
Because
I think.
of Nixon.
And we've never really recovered.
Right.
Exactly.
But it seems to me, I mean, that would be, I guess, my hypothesis if I had to say, what do I think of as the great legacy of Vietnam? I guess I would say, it seems to me it's a breakdown of a sense of the public altogether. That you think of after World War II, there was this tremendous, or going into World War II, a kind of tremendous sense of what it meant to participate in public life, which meant you would serve in the military or at least go along with the draft. It means that you had a belief in the government, for the most part. It means that you felt like, well, we're more or less in it together here, and that somehow, by the end of Vietnam, all of those things seems to start to fall apart. That there's a loss of trust in the government. There's less sense of participation in the military. In fact, the draft gets eliminated altogether as a sort of like, well, that's, if we draft people into the military, they're just likely to protest against things. And so it seems to me there's this kind of erosion overall of the whole public sphere. I'm just wondering, if that seems correct or if that's putting too much burden on the legacy of this war.
Well, I think a lot of the common persons that were drafted and taken into the service or actually enlisted had a trust in the government and a belief that they were actually serving and doing something right. I remember talking to a Vietnam veteran who was at Walter Reed recovering from wounds when he watched the television when Johnson announced he wasn't going to run for re-election. He felt totally betrayed, and he said he threw his bedpan at the TV. He felt like, well, and I also was in the enlisted club in Germany with the senior NCOs getting totally drunk as they watched Saigon fall. They felt like totally betrayed, and their government let them down.
Yeah.
I would just say two things. There certainly was what often gets termed the Cold War consensus in the wake of World War II that after that time, the United States, really in an unprecedented way, had kind of stepped into a role of world leadership, leader of the free world and that kind of thing. And as long as it went reasonably well, there was certainly a broad consensus for that. Although if you look at, for example, support for the Korean War, it's a curve that looks a lot like support for the Vietnam War, without the major anti-war movement issues, without the television covering it in the same way. In other words, the reaction to the slow or appearance of slow or lack of achievement, coupled with the deaths of young men coming home, some of whom were drafted. You see similar arcs in Korea, you see similar arcs in relation to Iraq with far lower death tolls. So I do think that the Vietnam War shatters the Cold War consensus, and you end up with what sometimes gets referred to as the Vietnam syndrome, which I would just suggest is the absence of that consensus, that these things are debatable in a way that they had not been among Americans from World War II down to the time of Vietnam. The one other cautionary note as an historian that I would make to the idea of everybody's on the team in the 40s and the 50s is, of course, the United States is riven by divisions, race divisions, for example. In other words, there were people that were not on the team, or at least not equals on the team in that period. And so, in some ways, to overplay, and I realize you weren't doing this, but overplay the greatest generation and when we were all together versus Vietnam, there are ways I would suggest that the country has gotten better in certain ways, even after the 60s. That are part of this, although that is not without controversy, as the 2016 election has shown.
Al. And I think one of the remarkable things about Vietnam is how durable that Cold War consensus was. That is, how long after the escalation of 1965, public opinions seem more or less to be on the side of the administration. And
does it feel long to you? I don't necessarily perceive it that way. Do you feel like it's sustained for a long time?
You mean into the 80s, essentially?
Oh, no, I just meant from 65 to 68.
Oh, 65 to 68.
Yeah, but, there's some, already by 67, there are major protests, and some of that's caving in.
Right. But
Fulbright's holding his hearings in early 66.
I was there the day those opened. But yes, I think much of the objection to Johnson's conduct of the war was from a hawkish point of view. So the 1968 New Hampshire primary, for example, is often seen as a first stirring of anti-Johnson sentiment, but it was much more from the right than it was from the left. That is, a plurality of the people who voted for Eugene McCarthy against Johnson in 1968 in New Hampshire ended up voting for George Wallace in the fall, who had as his running mate General Curtis LeMay, whose position on Vietnam was bound back to the Stone Age. And also we ended up voting against A Dove's Dove in 1972, George McGovern. So I'm not sure that Cold War consensus fully eroded. The objection to Johnson, it seems to me, was more that he wasn't doing enough than that he was doing too little.
Right. Although I guess when we talk about consensus, what I'm talking about is mainstream Democratic and Republican opinion. And largely speaking, that was behind this. But by the time you get to the end of the war, the Democrats are moving.
What has been then the impact overall on the U.S.'s foreign policy, how we, since Vietnam, have conducted ourselves in the world? Have we learned a lesson? Have we drawn the wrong lessons? What has been the kind of effect of how we've thought about Vietnam on what we do now? I mean, to sort of try to bring it up to date a bit, here we are in the longest war we've ever been in right now in Afghanistan, but of course it's playing out very differently from how Vietnam has played out. What has been the thing that we have learned in terms of how the United States conducts itself in foreign wars and in terms of foreign threats and enemies and foreign policy more generally?
I think part of it is don't make trouble in households across the United States. I think the end of the draft is a big part of what happens here. In other words, if you make it an all-volunteer military, You start from the premise that they chose to join,
Right.
and that avoids taking a son from a family and then not having that son return. I think the government and people who are interested in different parts of the government, who are interested in projecting power, learned lessons about how to do it to try to avoid the pitfalls.
Right,
That
but that
cropped
puts
up in
more
Vietnam.
burden on the people who are in the military, and it also, in a way,
does.
disconnects the rest of the population
Mm-hmm.
from war, right?
Mm-hmm.
That all of a sudden we can be kind of blasé about Afghanistan if I don't have anyone that I know who's serving there.
I think
The
we
other,
see
the
that.
other thing I find interesting, Vietnam was on CBS, NBC
Yeah.
every night. You don't see the Afghan Iraq War on TV every night, do you?
Right,
So I think that's one thing the government learned. Let's don't promote it that much,
right.
and let's
But
not
Low
let's-
intensity conflict.
That-
That's
that's
a
it.
word that used in
Right.
Yep,
political
they-
science.
Yep.
But Don, I have a question for you as someone in who's dealing with veterans. I mean, on the one hand, it seems everywhere the idea that we're going to support our troops, and I take it that in some ways that is a legacy of the Vietnam vets, as you were saying. They've kind of taught people, well, look, we can't just spit on our returning soldiers. But I wonder if do vets ever feel like that's a kind of empty thing, that we can kind of salute the troops at the ball game and then but not really support them in a more serious way in terms of the resources that they need, or as well as the participation in the war that would be a real true public spirited statement?
Yeah, I think they really feel the general public really doesn't understand what it's like to serve and actually be put in those positions where you're having to decide whether you're going to pull the trigger or not when you're looking at somebody in the eye. And once the bullet goes downrange, you can't bring it back. And I hear that all the time. And I don't think the general public actually understands, no matter what they do, the trauma that people are exposed to in combat.
Yeah. Well, Al, let me ask you, I mean, I guess I could say, have we learned any lessons? Or maybe more importantly, what lesson should we be learning from Vietnam?
Well, since Derek's an expert on the Vietnam syndrome, he can address this in far greater depth than I could. I think one lesson we have maybe learned too well with the volunteer army is the dangers of having only our mercenaries fight for us, because as odious as I found the draft, as objectionable as I found it to be drafted to serve in a war whose purposes I thought were really dubious and that I thought was unnecessary, I often thought it was probably a good idea to have some of us there who didn't want to be there and who were going to tell people back in civilian life from a critical point of view what the particular war was like.
Right. Well, and it also called forth a kind of democratic spirit, because people knew they had serious skin in the game.
Right.
Yeah, I would just add 2 points about the draft and who served. One is that it's clearly recognized that the Vietnam War was, in the words of Christian Appy's title, a working class war. That the burden of the draft, even the draft, fell much more on working class Americans, often from rural places and things like that, and small work-a-day, towns on Long Island or whatever list you want to run, rather than those who went to college because of the college deferments and various things like this, that could be defended in terms of Cold War policy, but of course meant that the burdens fell not equally on people when it came to going to the war. And so, lots more working class kids ended up fighting in Vietnam. What's interesting about the all-volunteer army is that the same kids, by and large, are fighting for us now. Those are the kids who don't have other options, who don't go on to college, who say, this bonus for joining the Marines can buy a car for me. In other words, lots of middle class and upper middle class kids, frankly, would never think about joining the military and would not be drafted into it because we don't have a draft. The other thing I would point out, just an interesting detail, is that in the wake of 9/11 and on the run-up toward the Iraq War, there were members of Congress who were advocating to reinstitute the draft. these were liberal Democrats that wanted the draft to come back for this very reason. If Dick Cheney's family or any family had to think about the fact that members of their family might have to go and fight, it would mean you would have to think at least a second moment about whether this was necessary or not. And I think a lot of this is about deciding whether a war is necessary or justified or crucial or not.
But what about, Derek, what about the kind of political lesson, beyond the lessons about the military participation of our country? I mean, are there wars that we should not be getting involved in?
Yes.
That we...
Yes, all of these wars in the Middle East that we've started since 9/11, I would basically.
I mean, so does that mean we haven't learned a lesson
what
from
I would
Vietnam?
say is that what I would say is this: in the wake of Vietnam, there were brakes on committing troops to, peril abroad. There were the ghost of Vietnam was easily conjured as an element of debating these things, and so it led even the most sort of aggressive, conservative, political leaders like Ronald Reagan to actually be very careful with committing troops abroad. If you actually look at the Reagan years, as much as his rhetoric was very strong, there's the victory in Grenada, there's pulling the Marines out of Lebanon after the terrorist attack, which was done quietly. He actually doesn't put people in peril, despite the fact that he criticized his predecessor Jimmy Carter for not being strong enough. He doesn't do a lot of that. I would suggest to you that that is him recognizing that it's just not possible in the 80s. When we get to Afghanistan, Iraq, the Middle East now, the key moment is 9/11. The key moment is 9/11, which terrifies Americans, freaks them out enough that an administration that is in place that wants to go to war in the Middle East is able to do so. And that is what the George W. Bush administration does. They wish to go, they want to invade Iraq, and they have an opportunity to make that case and to get it through, even though at the time there were plenty of people talking about whether or not this might or might not be a good idea. But then we end up there. It seems to go great for a few months, but then we're bogged down. We're occupying a Middle Eastern country. Things don't go so well. And then it unfolds over years.
Don, we only have about a minute left here, but I'm curious about your lesson about Vietnam. Are we learning our lesson, or are we committing the same mistakes now with our foreign policy and with how we're treating our troops?
I think we're committing the same errors. I think there's a misunderstanding and not a real true appreciation of what it's like to be over in a foreign country fighting a war. And I think we're stuck in the same thing again. The only thing I think that they've learned is not to promote it every night on television or in the newspaper.
Very quickly, we only have a little bit left, but Al, I'll give you the last word here for us.
I'd like to backtrack for a minute from my earlier statement about the draft. I didn't mean to be idealizing the draft at all.
Yeah, no, I get it, but we only have a few seconds here. So.
I'd recommend a great essay by James Fallows titled "What Did You Do in the Class War, Daddy?" that beautifully illustrates the point that Derek made a few minutes ago about his Harvard and MIT classmates had their sheafs of papers getting them out of duty, while the blue-collar kids from Chelsea, the working-class neighborhood in Boston, were like lambs being led to the slaughter.
Well, anyway, thank you for a great discussion. And so I hope it's one that there's so many issues we haven't got to. I hope this is a conversation that people continue in their homes and communities. So thanks again to the panel, and we'll see you next time on Ethical Perspectives on the News.